The air on Oak Island was calm that morning, but there was something different about it. A strange silence covered the land, as if the ground itself was hiding something. The team had gathered near the excavation site, surrounded by heavy tools, cables, and machines that had become part of their daily life. Rick Lagina stood quietly, looking at the earth in front of him. His eyes had that old, determined spark, the one that had kept him digging for years. For him, Oak Island was not just a place. It was a promise, a mystery that refused to be forgotten. For centuries, people had come here chasing the same dream, a treasure buried deep in the soil, hidden behind traps and tunnels. Many believed it was the work of the Knights Templar, those mysterious warriors who vanished from history, leaving behind whispers of gold, sacred relics, and secrets tied to faith. Others said it was nothing more than a story. But Rick never believed that. He always felt the island was alive, that it spoke to those who listened closely. That morning, the dig was focused near Lot 5, not far from the old garden shaft. This area had given signs before, bits of wood, rusted nails, and fragments of metal that hinted at something man-made beneath the surface. The machines rumbled as the team worked, removing layer after layer of dirt. It was slow, careful work. Rick and Marty had learned through the years that Oak Island punished anyone who rushed. But what happened that day was beyond anything they expected. Gary Drayton, the team's metal detection expert, moved across the area with his detector, the sound of the device echoing softly in the morning air. Suddenly, the machine gave a strong, deep signal. It wasn't a short beep of a coin or a nail. It was long, continuous, and powerful. Gary froze. He looked at Rick and nodded. "Something big is down here," he said, his voice steady but excited. The rest of the team gathered around. They began to dig carefully, brushing away the soil inch by inch. After a few minutes, a dull shine appeared under the dirt. It wasn't gold, but iron, dark and rough, like an old plate. Rick bent down, touched the metal, and felt the coldness even through his gloves. The structure was flat and wide, not a simple piece of scrap. As they cleared more soil, its shape became clearer. It looked like a sealed door, a hatch, completely buried and made of thick iron. Everyone stepped back for a moment. The air felt heavier. Rick could almost feel the history pressing against him. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Rick whispered, "This isn't just another find. This is something else." Marty crouched beside him, studying the hatch closely. It had no handles, no bolts, no markings, only a smooth, rusted surface. It looked ancient, as if it had been sleeping there for centuries, waiting for someone to notice it. "Why didn't we see this before?" Marty said quietly. Rick didn't answer. Deep down, he knew why. Oak Island only showed what it wanted to show, and only when it was ready. The team continued to clear the area. Every shovel of dirt made the mystery grow deeper. The hatch was about 6 feet wide, thick, and buried in compacted earth. The edges were perfectly aligned, too precise to be natural.
Be natural. This was man-made, and whoever built it didn't want it to be found easily. Gary ran his detector again over the edges. The signal spread in a pattern, suggesting more metal extending underground. "It's not just a plate," Gary said. "It's connected to something bigger." Rick stood silently, thinking about the years of digging, the endless theories, the countless disappointments. But this moment felt different. It was as if they had reached the heart of the mystery. The wind shifted suddenly, cold and sharp, making the nearby trees rustle. Everyone felt it. "Did you feel that?" Jack Beagley asked. Rick nodded slowly. "It's like the island's breathing," he said. They decided to pause before touching the hatch further. Marty wanted to bring in the scanners and safety gear first, but Rick couldn't stop staring at it. He brushed some soil away with his hands, revealing more of the surface. The iron was corroded, but solid. The smell of earth mixed with the faint scent of rust. For a moment, Rick felt the chill run down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but it felt like he was standing on the edge of something that had waited centuries to be uncovered. When the rest of the crew stepped back to bring equipment, Rick stayed near the hatch. He placed his hand on the cold metal and closed his eyes. The sound of waves crashing on the distant shore filled the air. In that moment, he remembered all the stories. The young men who first dug here in the 1700s, the layers of wood, the mysterious marks on trees, the money pit that swallowed lives and fortunes. So many had tried. So many had failed. But maybe, just maybe, this was the clue they all missed. By the time the sun began to set, the hatch was almost completely exposed. It looked like a door without a key, guarding something ancient. Marty returned with a crowbar and some hand tools. "Let's see if this thing even moves," he said. Rick nodded. The first attempt failed. The crowbar barely slipped under the edge. They tried again from another angle, but the hatch didn't budge. It was sealed tight, as if welded by time itself. The sound of metal scraping against iron echoed across the site. After several minutes, they heard a faint thud from beneath. Everyone froze. It wasn't loud, but it was real. Gary's face turned serious. "Did you hear that?" he said softly. Rick raised his hand. "Quiet." They all listened. A second later, there was another faint noise, like air being released from a small space. A soft vibration ran through the ground. For a few seconds, no one dared to breathe. Then, silence returned. "What was that?" Jack asked. Marty frowned. "Could be trapped air," he said. But Rick shook his head. "No, that sounded different." His instincts told him they had just triggered something. Maybe a passage, maybe a mechanism, or maybe something older and stranger. The decision was made to stop for the night. Rick agreed, though reluctantly. "We'll come back tomorrow," he said, "with everything we need." As the team packed up, the cameras continued to roll, capturing every detail. But later that night, when they reviewed the footage, something strange appeared. Just before the sound was heard, the main camera flickered, then went dark for 3 seconds. The backup camera also glitched at the same moment. There was no explanation. The equipment had been working perfectly. The next day, when they returned to the site, the air felt even heavier. The moment they powered up the cameras, one of them failed again. Gary's metal detector suddenly went silent, no signal, no beep, as if the ground itself had swallowed the sound. Marty tried to use his radio, but the signal broke, replaced by a faint whispering noise. Everyone looked around nervously. "This is strange," Marty muttered. Rick simply said, "The island's protecting something." They checked all the devices. The batteries were full, the connections fine. Yet around the hatch, everything electronic seemed to fail. It was as if some invisible force surrounded it. The team's technical expert said quietly, "The GPS is also not working. It's shifting locations randomly." Rick looked at him and said, "Then we're standing on something that doesn't want to be found." The wind picked up again, brushing through the trees like a whisper. The waves hit the shore with a dull rhythm, slow and steady. The crew stood around the hatch, their breath turning into white mist in the cold morning air. Rick Lagina's eyes stayed fixed on that dark metal surface, while Marty paced back and forth, deep in thought. Something about that place felt wrong, or maybe too right.
Gary Drayton crouched down and brushed away the last bits of soil around the hatch. He ran his detector again, even though the signal was fading. For a second, there was nothing. Then a weak tone broke the silence. "There it is again," Gary said, frowning. "It's faint, but it's deep. Whatever's down there, it's big." Rick knelt beside him. "Could it be a chamber?" Gary looked at him. "If it is, it's sealed for a reason." They brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan below the hatch. The screen flickered, then displayed strange shapes. The lines didn't make sense, too straight to be natural, too irregular to be machinery. It looked like a space, a hollow area, but not empty. There were dense pockets beneath the metal, shapes that looked almost arranged. "Could be support beams," Marty said. "Or something stored," Rick replied quietly. The team exchanged glances. The word hung heavy in the air. Stored. If the hatch really led to a hidden chamber, it could be the missing link in a mystery that had haunted Oak Island for centuries, the final passage leading to the money pit, or something even older. As they studied the radar data, one of the technicians noticed something odd. "There's a pattern here," he said, pointing to the screen. "These beams form a cross. Not perfect, but close." Rick leaned closer. "A cross?" The technician nodded. "It could just be coincidence, but it looks deliberate." Gary rubbed his chin. "Knights Templar," he said softly. No one spoke for a long moment. The connection was obvious. The Templar cross, the ancient rumors, the relics found before. Could this hatch be the final entrance they had searched for all these years? Rick's heart pounded in his chest. He remembered every night he'd stared at the old maps, every book he'd read about secret chambers and sacred relics. Maybe this was it, the final piece of the puzzle. They decided to open the hatch that day. But first, Rick wanted to check something. He walked back to the research trailer and brought out one of the oldest maps of the island, a faded parchment copy of an 18th century drawing. He spread it on the table. There, in the same spot where they had found the hatch, was a small mark, a square surrounded by a cross symbol. Rick tapped the spot with his finger. "This mark," he said quietly, "was never explained. Some thought it was a boundary. But what if it wasn't? What if it was this?" Marty leaned closer. "Are you saying someone marked this hatch on a map hundreds of years ago?" Rick nodded slowly. "Yes, and they didn't want anyone else to find it." The sun climbed higher, but the sky stayed gray. They set up ropes and safety gear preparing to lift the hatch. Marty gave the signal and the winch began to tighten.
A groaning metal filled the air as the edge of the hatch began to shift. Dust and a rust fell like powder. Everyone held their breath. Then, a snap. The cable jerked and the hatch moved slightly, revealing a thin gap. Cold air rose from below, carrying with it a smell none of them could describe, a mix of salt, iron, and something ancient. Gary whispered, "That's not just air, that's time." They widened the gap, just enough for a flashlight. Rick leaned forward and shone the light inside. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The beam hit a wooden surface about 10 feet down, planks arranged neatly, almost like a floor. But in the center of that wooden surface was something else, a symbol carved into the wood. It was faint, worn by time, but clear enough to recognize. A cross, the same one they'd seen on the radar. Rick pulled back slowly, his voice shaking. "It's there, the same mark, the same cross." Marty swallowed hard. "Then we found something real." But as they tried to lift the hatch further, one of the cables snapped. The hatch slammed back into place with a thunderous clang that echoed across the site. The vibration shook the ground. Dust rose into the air. A low rumble followed, deep, distant, like the earth itself groaning. Everyone stepped back in panic. The rumble grew louder for a few seconds, then stopped. The island went still again. Rick looked around. "Is everyone okay?" They nodded, but their faces were pale. Gary muttered, "The island's warning us." Rick stared at the hatch. "Maybe," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean we stop." They decided to secure the area for the night. No one wanted to risk another collapse. But Rick stayed behind after everyone left. He sat near the hatch, flashlight in hand, staring at the ground. The cold crept into his bones, but he didn't move. He spoke quietly, as if to the island itself. "I've given you everything. Years of my life. I've respected you, listened to you. If there's something here, I'll find it. But I won't take it. I just want to understand." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment he thought he heard something else, a faint sound from below, almost like a whisper. He froze. It came again, a soft, echoing voice. He couldn't make out the words, but it felt old, distant, sad. Rick stepped back, heart pounding. He looked around, but there was no one there. The sound faded, leaving only the crackle of the waves. He switched off the flashlight and stood in silence. The moon broke through the clouds for a brief second, shining on the hatch. It almost seemed to glint, as if something beneath it was alive. Rick whispered, "Tomorrow, we open it." The next morning came gray and silent. A light fog covered the island, wrapping everything in a soft, cold stillness. The team gathered early, their breath visible in the crisp air. No one said much. They all knew what this day meant. Rick stood beside the hatch again. He hadn't slept much. The sound he'd heard the night before still echoed in his mind, that faint whisper from beneath the ground. Was it real, or had his mind been playing tricks after so many years of chasing mysteries? He couldn't tell anymore. Marty arrived with the equipment truck, his face serious. "Let's get this done right," he said. "No mistakes." They replaced the broken cables with new, stronger ones. 2 excavators stood ready nearby, their engines humming quietly. Safety ropes were laid out. Everyone had a role. Rick looked at each of them. Gary, Marty, Alex, and the others. They had been through everything together. Storms, cave-ins, false leads, and empty tunnels. But this felt different. Rick gave the signal. The winch started again, pulling hard on the cables. The hatch groaned, resisting at first, then slowly began to lift. The sound of metal scraping against stone echoed through the clearing. Bit by bit, it rose higher until a large enough opening appeared for a person to fit through. A rush of cold air burst out from the darkness below. It was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of earth and salt. Gary shined his flashlight down. "Looks about 10 feet to the floor," he said. "We can rig a rope ladder." Rick nodded. "I'll go first." Marty
Word, veritas, truth. Gary called down from above. "What do you see?" Rick looked up. "There's writing down here, something old. Looks like a dedication or a warning." "Want me to come down?" Gary asked. "Yeah, bring a camera." Within minutes, Gary was beside him, flashlight in one hand, metal detector in the other. He scanned the ground. The device beeped softly near one corner of the chamber. Rick crouched and started to dig carefully with his hands. The dirt was thick and cold, like it hadn't been touched in centuries. Something solid appeared, a small chest wrapped in rotted fabric. It was about the size of a toolbox, covered in corrosion but intact. Rick and Gary exchanged a look. Marty's voice echoed from above. "You found something?" Rick answered, "Yeah, a chest." Marty sighed. "Of course you did." They lifted the chest carefully and placed it under the light. Gary tried to pry it open, but it didn't budge. It was sealed tight. There was no keyhole, only a strange symbol carved into the metal lid. The same cross shape they'd seen on the radar and on the wood above. Rick touched the symbol. It felt slightly raised, like a button. He pressed down gently. A faint click. Everyone froze. Then the lid loosened on its own, as if released by an invisible lock. Slowly they lifted it open. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in decayed cloth. Rick unfolded it carefully, layer by layer. Inside was an old leather book, or what was left of one. The cover was dark brown, cracked with age and bound with thin metal strips. Rick whispered, It's a manuscript. Gary leaned closer. How old do you think? Rick shook his head. I don't know, but it's not modern. Look at this. It's written by hand. They turned a few fragile pages. The ink had faded, but some words were still visible, a mix of Latin and symbols. On one page was a drawing, a map, circular, with what looked like a coastline and markings that could represent Oak Island. Gary stared. That's the island. Look, that's the swamp, the triangle, the money pit. Rick's voice trembled. It's older than any map we've ever seen. At the back of the book, they found another folded paper, pressed flat and sealed with wax. The wax bore the same cross symbol. Rick hesitated for a moment, then broke the seal. Inside was a short note written in a language that looked like
Old French. He could only make out a few words. La vérité sous la croix, gardée par les serments. Gary frowned. My French is rusty, but something about the truth beneath the cross, guarded by the oath. Rick looked back at the plaque on the wall. The truth beneath the cross, he murmured. He turned to the floor where the chest had been buried. The wooden planks were uneven there. One section looked newer than the rest. He knelt down, knocking lightly on the wood. A hollow sound answered. There's more, he said. They called up to Marty and the others. Within minutes, the rest of the team joined them in the chamber, setting up lights and cameras. They began to lift the planks one by one. Beneath them was another layer, stone this time, with strange carvings all over it. Circles, arrows, letters. And in the center of that stone slab was a small metal ring, rusted but still solid. Marty whispered, Another hatch? Rick nodded slowly. Or the last one. Rick brushed away the dirt surrounding the metal ring. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally cold as though it hadn't felt open air for centuries. The ring was embedded in a carved stone slab covered in faint inscriptions that twisted and looped in ways no one could quite decipher. Gary ran his hand along one of the markings. These aren't tool marks, he said quietly. They're symbols. Someone took time to make these. Marty crouched beside them. You think it's a door? Rick nodded. Or a seal. They shined the flashlights closer. The carvings seemed to form a circular pattern, a kind of spiral leading toward the metal ring in the center. Around it were 4 Latin words: lux, fides, sanguis, veritas. Light, faith, blood, truth, Gary translated softly. Alex exhaled. That doesn't sound like a door. That sounds like a warning. Rick hesitated, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. He grabbed a crowbar and wedged it beneath the ring. Help me with this. Marty gripped the other side, and together they pulled. The ring didn't budge. Rick adjusted his stance and tried again, harder this time. A dull clang echoed through the chamber, then a faint hiss, as if air was escaping from beneath the stone. Everyone froze. Pressure release? Gary asked. Or a seal breaking, Rick replied. Slowly, the slab began to lift, revealing a dark gap underneath. Cold mist seeped out, thick and white, curling around their feet. The smell was stronger now, old earth and something metallic. Rick pointed his flashlight into the opening. The beam disappeared into darkness. It goes deeper, he murmured. A tunnel, maybe. Marty swallowed. How deep do you think? Rick shook his head. No way to tell. Gary lowered the metal detector again, sweeping it across the edges. The device chirped instantly. Metal all around. Maybe walls, or maybe something buried in there. Rick's heartbeat quickened. We need to go down. Hold on, Marty said firmly. We don't know what's down there. Could be unstable, could be worse. Rick looked at him, eyes steady. Everything on this island has been unstable, Marty. every tunnel, every shaft. But this could be what they were hiding. The cross, the markings, the map, it all points here. There was a long pause. Then Marty sighed. All right, but we do this safely. They secured ropes and lowered a small camera drone through the opening first. The live feed flickered on the monitor.